I'm Joe Devine, and welcome to Whiteboard Football Extra. Today, I'm joined by Alex Stewart to talk about Frank de Boer and Crystal Palace and the tactical transition the team is currently undergoing, successfully or, more potently, less successfully. Also, a quick note to say that if you can please rate us on iTunes, leave a comment, leave a review. That's all really useful, or SoundCloud as well on YouTube. If you can comment on that, it really helps us. It pushes us up a little bit higher in search functions, so other people can find the podcast as well. We really appreciate that. So if you're enjoying listening and downloading, if you can take a couple of minutes to do that, that'd be fantastic. Thanks very much for downloading the podcast. I hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you again next week. It's 3 games and 3 losses for Crystal Palace in the Premier League so far this season. The team did manage a win against Ipswich Town in the EFL Cup, but are only just above West Ham in the league table heading into international break. That's also on goal difference, that's not on points. Both teams have lost all their games so far. Alex, much of the analysis so far has been regarding the team's switch to De Boer's Ajax-inspired ball retention-based system. Are these early issues just teething problems, or is it emblematic of a bigger problem for Palace, you think?
I think the honest answer to that is that it's probably too soon to tell. But the transition between one style and another, in this instance, the kind of Sam Allardyce inspired, longer balls, quick breaks down the flanks, to what De Boer is trying to do is a very significant change. And it's not just the formational change that's occurred, it's a complete kind of stylistic volte-face. And it does seem like the Palace players are struggling to adapt to that. I mean, I don't think that's their only issue. I think that there are not players in that formation that are naturally suited to playing in a 3-5-2 or a 3-4-2-1.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult to see, particularly if you look at the sort of back 3 and wide players, or back 5 if you want to call them that. Really only maybe Fosu Mensah has had some experience of playing in a 3, although bearing in mind for a lot of the time that he was at Manchester United as a youth player, he was also playing as a kind of defensive midfielder. Van Aanholt has played in a 5 at the back or as a wing back in a 3, but again, not regularly and not recently. So straight away, you're asking a group of players who have been well drilled in a pretty rigorous kind of 4-4-2 style, defensively, not fullbacks that were encouraged to get forward a lot. All of a sudden, you're asking them to play in a very, very different style. And
it's interesting that you mention Timothy Fosu Mensah as well, having some experience of playing in a back 3. It happened rarely, obviously. He was still very young, but he did come through under Van Gaal at United, and he did play occasionally in that back 3 there. And we, during the video that we made about Crystal Palace and Frank de Boer, we mentioned the links to Van Gaal as well, and the dangers of creating with that system a sort of stolid passing sideways thing that we saw with Van Gaal. So it's interesting as well that there's a player who might be playing under both. You wonder how his experience of that formation actually worked out for him.
Yeah, I mean, I don't doubt that was a deliberate recruitment effort by De Boer to bring in a defender who was versatile and can play in a sort of defensive central midfield role if required, but also somebody who is not only used to that formation but reasonably used to that style of play. But then again, as you correctly said, he's not exactly an old head. He's not had a huge amount of Premier League experience. So while you're bringing in somebody who should be quicker to adapt, that's not a player that's going to inspire the others around him to do the same. He's not a player who's necessarily going to feel comfortable looking to his left and screaming instructions at Scott Dan and James Tompkins, who've both played a lot of Premier League football. And I think it's important to bear in mind as well that in Wayne Hennessy, Crystal Palace have got a goalkeeper who didn't impress at all last season. And, Palace had issues with goalkeeping. They started with Steve Mandander. I think there were probably language problems there, and went back to Hennessy, who'd actually been impressive the season previously. But again, the organisation that's required by a goalkeeper of a back three and the two dropping back, they need to be very dominant. They need to be absolutely commanding their box, commanding their players, and there's potentially some sort of issue there where a goalkeeper's coming off a pretty shaky season, being asked to impose themselves, instruct their defence in a system that they're probably not comfortable with either. And it's just creating a lot of issues. I think the midfield is unbalanced as well. I just think that it's, we've talked before, it's a thread that's cropped up in a number of our videos, and the difference maybe between domestic football and international football about building a system around a player. And I think here Palace have done the opposite. They've built a system irrespective of their players, and are now desperately trying to cram them in to a way that a manager wants to play.
Well, that's on my questions list, actually, about adaptation. We'll get to that a little bit later on. I want to ask you more about some of the specific players. As we talk about suitability there are obviously, Palace have a number of key players. I mean, Wilfried Zaha, who, to his credit, has looked good this season, looked very good towards the end of last season. And, of course, as well, Christian Benteke, Jason Puncheon, who had been playing in that central midfield berth, which is perhaps slightly unusual for a player who's used to being much more of an attacking force. I wonder how well suited these players individually are to the system. So let's start with Wilfried Zaha. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm right, but it seems to me that he's talented enough to be able to play really in any position of the front three. Is that fair enough to say? You don't think he's been caused too many problems by the change?
No, I think he's probably the one player who is of sufficient quality and to a degree versatility to be able to get away with it. I think the issue with Zaha is that his greatest strength is taking men on, dribbling, and then either cutting inside or trying to pull back across. And so it's not that he's not good enough to adapt, it's just that actually this system doesn't really play to his strengths.
Particularly if it's risk averse.
Exactly. And Zaha is a hugely exciting attacking talent. And to be fair to Palace under Allardyce, when they had, Zaha and usually Townsend on either flank of a sort of 4-2-3-1, they went for it. They did. They weren't always successful in their execution, and both players, both Zaha and Townsend, are capable of wasting possession quite a lot. But there was intent there, and Puncheon sat just behind the striker and kind of orchestrated that. And now, when you have this risk-averse system that doesn't encourage the two players that sit behind the striker to get quite so wide, in case there's a kind of congestion with the overlapping wing backs, that they're expected to cut inside quite a lot as well, then it seems to me that you're maybe taking... I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that Zaha is Palace's best player, maybe Benteke. You're not playing to that player's strengths, which does seem odd, particularly when the rest of the squad seems so ill-fitted for this system as well.
Yeah. And let's think about the central midfield. We've got Jason Puncheon and Milivojevic in there as well. We mentioned that a little bit in the video. What are the keys to a central midfield two here in a system where the team are playing five at the back or three at the back with those two? I mean, I suppose, as we say, Townsend and Zaha will be encouraged to cut in, but naturally they probably both are wingers. So what are the key tenets of the role for Puncheon and Milivojevic in there?
Well, I think one of those, which is probably why Puncheon is a bad fit for it, is positional discipline. I mean, if you look at how Chelsea executed this last season, you would rarely see either of that central midfield axis getting particularly far forward. Occasionally, Kante would go up. But essentially, you are sitting there partly to screen the back three, partly because the wing backs are encouraged to get forward, and what you don't want to do is create a position where there are suddenly huge amounts of space on either flank just ahead of where the wide centre backs are. So those midfielders need to be in a position where they can either hold where they are, or they can drop back almost diagonally across to cover into the fullback spaces. And they also need to be able to screen and tackle in that central area. I mean, they were outclassed by Leroy Fer and Sam Clucas in the recent Swansea game. Sam Clucas is a really good signing by Swansea, I'd point out. But Punchin is not that kind of central midfielder. Punchin is creative. He's good at getting into the box and feeding off knockdowns. And he's not. He's quite
exactly
squirrely.
I've always found Jason Punchin to be quite squirrely in that he emerges from congested situations somehow with the ball.
Yes, yeah,
but not always looking, like he's done it with the elegance of Hazard. Do you know what I mean?
I think that's fair. Yes, and I think he's regarded with a degree of affection by all the clubs that he's played for, including Southampton. But he's not going to sit back and either like a Nemanja Matic or to a lesser degree a Cesc Fabregas kind of ping passes from deep. He's not going to shuttle backwards and forwards like N'Golo Kante screening and putting in tackles. And I think Milivojevic is a good player, actually. And I think he looked really quite solid in a midfield two under Allardyce. And I note that they went for MacArthur in this game. Again, MacArthur is kind of more workmanlike. And so it looks like they're maybe thinking in the right direction. But it seems to me that in Johan Cabaye, who did come on in this game, you've got a ready-made, deeper-sitting playmaker of the kind of Matic style, or somebody who can play that role. I mean, Cabaye, when Cabaye was in that superb Newcastle midfield axis with Cheick Tiote, he was the one who sat back and directed things a bit more, while Tiote did the sort of shuttling backwards and forwards. So there are players in that squad who are maybe better suited. Jeffrey Schlupp rather than Patrick Van Aanholt in the left wing back role, again, is another possibility.
Looking for a replacement for Joel Ward perhaps as well on the right.
I think that's an absolute necessity. I mean, you could consider playing MacArthur there, but I think they do need to find somebody. But I mean, look, it's a combination for me. They've undergone effectively what is almost a philosophical change in the way they want to play under De Boer. They've got some players who might suit that, who aren't getting time. They've got a lot of players who don't suit that. You've got their best player, probably Zaha, in a role that's not entirely suited to what he's really good at doing.
Yeah,
it just seems like a bit of a mess.
It's interesting as well when we talk about the central midfield axis there, because I think there were a couple of examples this weekend that can really prove how important what you're saying is, particularly from a positive point of view. I think there was Nemanja Matic put in another brilliant performance with Manchester United. There were a couple of times when Daley Blind had gone forward and didn't have the pace to track back. You often saw Matic pulling out left, right to the wing, covering in that, as you said, sort of diagonally backwards, covering in for the fullback. And then quite a negative example of two central midfielders in poor positions is obviously Xhaka and Ramsey from the Arsenal game. I mean, it was quite incredible. I thought I watched Match of the Day too, and the analysis of that. It was quite incredible, the amount of space that was being left in behind when they went forward. And also, just from a sort of really straightforward perspective, just the fact that there's two players who should be there who aren't there, even if they aren't doing anything, they're just standing there. They make such a massive difference to the flow of play and stopping in the counter-attack. The fact that they weren't there just gave Liverpool so much space to run into. So I think those two things are really important. We can see examples of them from all around the league happening every weekend. Let's talk about adaptation now. We mentioned it briefly before as it applies to managers. But there is an interesting question in this, I think, insofar as what makes a good manager. Is it someone who will come into a new club and imprint their own style and make it work, as Frank de Boer is trying to do here? Or is it someone who can adapt to new situations, look to get the best out of the squad's individual talents by being more reflexive tactically? Because it strikes me, and as you said right at the beginning of this podcast, it's probably too early to tell, but it does strike me personally that Crystal Palace have made quite a bizarre move to sign De Boer, because obviously you can think, okay, we want to play a ball retention style of play. If we think in the long term that's going to benefit us, and we know it's going to be a slightly difficult transitional period to get to that point. But for me, the benefits of playing that ball retention system would have to be, so great to take the risk of going through this cloudy area now, or the manager that you have acquired would have to be so great to justify it. Does that make sense?
It does. It struck me as a slightly bizarre appointment at the time. Not that Frank de Boer... I mean, the question that you've asked is a very big one, which, is not surprising because you do like to throw those in from time to time. Managers have, generally speaking, got preferred systems. For De Boer, this is his preferred... I mean, actually, his preferred system is basically the sort of 3-4-3 of the Ajax style. When you look at recruiting a manager as a club, I think fundamentally what you need to ask is, what are our long-term goals, obviously, but in the short term, who are we recruiting? What is their preferred system? What is their track record at getting players who aren't used to that system to buy into it and to engage on the training ground in such a way as to translate that onto the pitch in games? And who do we have in the squad who works for that system, for what he's trying to do? And I think that it may be the case that, okay, so if you look at Manchester United and the recruitment they've done, clearly there are players there now that Mourinho has specifically asked for. But that is part of a slow transition from the squad he inherited to presumably a kind of ideal squad that he has in his mind. But stylistically, there weren't an enormous amount of changes that were needed to enact that. So he's been able to kind of guide the team through this. I know they weren't amazing last season, but I think they were better than maybe the final league position showed. But he can affect that transition quite slowly. He can start to bring his players in so that if he does decide down the line to make systemic or tactical changes, he's done that in a way that doesn't weaken the team's current performance. With Crystal Palace, what they've done is they've taken a team that's used to playing one way, and then they've brought in a manager. They've not immediately splashed out on bringing in players that suit that manager's system. And they've said to the players on the training ground, right, go for it. Start playing in this totally different way, in this totally different formation. So I think while you can have good and bad managers, but I think there's an onus on the clubs. I'd love to know what the thinking behind De Boer's recruitment was. Is it simply
presumably you can only assume it must be a long-term plan? I mean, I cannot see what other benefit there would be in recruiting him.
I mean, he's a big name. He's managed in Serie A, albeit quite unsuccessfully. He's won titles, and Palace have been stuck in a bit of a managerial rut of late. Going back to sort of slightly punchy English managers that can save them from relegation every once in a while, and maybe they felt that it was time to step up and to embrace the new thinking, the new ideas that might come from bringing in a continental manager who's won championships and done well. And I guess that was their thinking. I mean, you never know whether there's actually a great. I know from talking to people. I think it's just
who is available, right?
Well, I'm sure yes and no to a degree. There are always going to be managers who are unavailable by either the nature of their kind of talent and reputation. Crystal Palace were never going to sign Pep Guardiola, right?
No, of course, but I'm sorry to interject again, but I think you really can tell the difference in Premier League clubs. For example, when Southampton look for a new manager, often, certainly the last 2 or 3, they come up with a name that perhaps not everyone's heard of, a name that isn't on, the sort of where will this manager go next carousel. And they tend to do it clearly with a lot of thought involved, clearly with a system in mind, clearly with a long-term plan, or at least a potential short-term strategy if they think the manager's going to move on again, and they do it reasonably well. I think, and I'm not picking on Crystal Palace here specifically, but I think there are a number of clubs in the Premier League who, when they're in need of a manager, and because short-termism is what it is in today's football game, I think they just look at that shortlist that is repeatedly mentioned by every pundit on Sky Sports, and they pick the one who they think is the biggest. I don't want to be too negative about Crystal Palace, and as you said, it's too early to tell. It could be that Frank de Boer does a fantastic job, but I just cannot see why. I can understand your point about taking the next step. I totally appreciate that, but there's 2 things for me which make this, beyond the tactical changes, such a strange appointment. The first one is that it clearly wasn't the time to do it. They've just had the squad shift to the philosophy of Sam Allardyce, right? Literally in the last year, and they did it to great effect. And Sam Allardyce brought in a couple of players to suit that style of play. So getting a manager who is the antithesis of that to come in immediately afterwards seems like a strange thing. The second thing is that Frank de Boer was in Serie A for 18 games, and he was sacked from Milan. He was with Ajax for 5 years, 2 or 3 seasons of which were successful, but he's playing and promoting a style of football which, in my opinion, it might be successful in Eredivisie, but in the Premier League in the last 3 to 4, maybe 5 years, has shown itself to be on the wane. And I think if you're looking for a European continental manager to come in and try something new, you'd probably want someone in the vein of Pochettino, or in the Bielsa school of thinking, rather than someone who, maybe it's too harsh of me to say, seems like with that I don't know, the kind of ball retention style to be flogging a dead dog.
If you think Palace have struggled under Frank de Boer, I would love to see Palace being coached by Marcelo Bielsa. I think people would.
I'm not saying it would.
They would spontaneously combust. Can you imagine Andros Townsend trying to? I mean, it's.
But if my point was that if they wanted to take a big leap, then there would be more sensible directions to jump in.
Everything that you've said about that appointment, I agree with, and I think you can very obviously contrast it with Southampton. And while Palace's recent results have not been great, I think Palace would probably see themselves as being a club of the ilk of Southampton. Fortunately, as a Southampton fan, how things have been going off the field has solidified our financial state to a degree. So I would say we are in a position to recruit a bit more sensibly. But Swansea, who Palace played. Swansea hadn't registered a shot on target before they played Palace, and they managed to beat them 2-0 away. Paul Clement, I think, is another really good example of somebody who has coached in the English game. I think his time at Derby was actually better, and I couldn't massively understand why he was sacked at that point. But he's also got top flight experience on the continent. He's worked with a host of superb managers as a coach or as an assistant manager, and he's clearly intelligent, tactically flexible and astute, and Swansea have got somebody there that realistically you could have in place for a good 5, possibly more seasons if he's given the time. That was sensible recruiting. And it's odd because we know full well that metrics and data have become integral to the scouting of players. There's plenty of information on manager performances too. It's not like you couldn't say to one of these consultancy firms that provides recruitment advice for football clubs, ask them about managers. You could get a list of managers that play particular styles, who have particularly high, ball retention or particularly good penetration or passes per defensive action, whatever metric you want to talk about, because you're just looking at team stats. And it seems very odd that, almost like you say, that you can infer to a degree from certain Premier League appointments that they've either kind of put their hand in the bowl of English managers and pulled one khaki out, or it's the biggest name continental coach who happens to be out of a job.
Yeah.
And you've always got to look at why people are out of a job.
Yeah. But you mentioned in the Crystal Palace video, actually, that the last season or two at Ajax wasn't really that successful for De Boer, and that in some ways he was tactically stagnating.
Well, that's one of the key points as well, is that I think bodes ill for Palace. And I drew on an article that Priya Ramesh, who's a very good writer on Dutch football, did on Frank de Boer for, I think it was Benefit. His greatest problem going into those last two seasons at Ajax was an unwillingness to change. Now, if you're Crystal Palace and you're in the squad and you're trying to play this 3-5-2, 3-4-2-1, and it's not working, and you look across at the touchline and you see a manager who's famed for his intransigence and his unwillingness to adapt, you have to be worried, because, I think it may be that this formation is the hill upon which Frank de Boer chooses to die, and he'd rather persist with it than make a transition which could, see Palace make short-term gains. That is another issue with management, which is that some coaches become so wedded to a philosophy that they would rather persist with that philosophy in the face of clear evidence that it's not working, rather than potentially listen to players. Footballers are not stupid, at least when it comes to football, and I'm sure some aren't stupid generally. If they are playing week in, week out with the same group of players, and they know what their strengths are, they know what worked last season, they know that the style of Allardyce worked last season, there are going to be players in that dressing room who may even be saying to De Boer, we have to change this, because this is disastrous. And as a coach, how much do you undermine yourself by going, okay, Scott Dan, I will listen to you. I will instigate a change back to a four-man defence. Now, that's probably the right move, at least in the short term, irrespective of their plans going forward. And De Boer has managed with a four at the back before. But what does it say about the relationship between the players and the coach? What does it say about the long-term goals of the club and how responsive they should be to the need for... we're not talking about survival at this point, but... should a club pin its colours to a particular mast going forwards and accept that actually that might doom them? No, clearly that's not going to happen. So at some point, either De Boer has to change, or they reappoint Sam Allardyce.
Yeah, he's available.
He's always available, isn't he?
But yeah, perhaps you're right. Perhaps through the eye, a spear made of the back three. Who knows? We'll find out anyway. Alex, thanks very much for your time today, and I'll speak to you again soon.
My pleasure. Thanks, Jay.